The silence was the first thing Sarah Mitchell had fallen in love with. Here, in the heart of Montana's winterlocked mountains, silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was in the heavy blanket of snow that swallowed every echo, the majestic stillness of the pines, laden with white, and the patient crystalline air that seemed to hold its breath. She was a librarian, an archivist by trade, and silence was her native tongue. This remote cabin entrusted to her for a month by a retiring professor was not a retreat, but a homecoming. Tonight, however, the silence was under siege. A blizzard born in the icy gut of the north had descended upon the range, and its voice was a feral howl that clawed at the cabin's log walls. Snow drove against the windows in horizontal sheets, a frantic, ghostly assault. Inside, Sarah was a small island of warmth and light. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, its golden light dancing over shelves of books and the simple rustic furniture. She clutched a mug of hot tea, her gaze lost in the hypnotic swirl of steam. A sudden violent crack split the air. Not the groan of a snow-heavy branch, but something sharper, more concussive. It sounded like a gunshot. Sarah froze, her heart seizing in her chest. She told herself it was the storm, a tree limb snapping with the explosive force of the cold. But the sound had felt metallic wrong. She waited, her senses stretched taut, listening past the wind scream. Nothing, only the blizzard's relentless fury. She tried to dismiss it, her city-bred paranoia acting up in the wilderness, but an uneasy current had disturbed the cabin's peaceful quiet. The fire seemed less comforting now. The shadows in the corners deeper, more menacing. Another hour passed. The storm raged on a timeless, churning chaos. It was a flicker of movement through the window, a brief, dark interruption in the white onslaught that drew her to her feet. She peered through the frosted glass, wiping a clear circle with the heel of her hand. For a moment, she saw nothing but the dizzying dance of snowflakes. Then she saw it again. A shape. A dark heap against the pure wind-swept white, not far from the edge of the woods that bordered the clearing. It was too large to be an animal too still. "Don't be a fool, Sarah," she whispered, her breath fogging the pain. "It's a fallen log, a shadow." But she knew it wasn't. It hadn't been there an hour ago. Her mind raced. Call for help. The landline was her only connection, but in a storm this severe would anyone even be able to reach her before morning? And what would she say? That she'd seen a suspicious lump in the snow. They would think she was a hysterical flatlander. Curiosity, that fatal human flaw, weared with a primal instinct for self-preservation. To open the door was to invite the storm inside, to invite the unknown. But to leave whoever was out there to be buried alive by the snow felt like a crime, worse than foolishness. Bundling herself in a heavy parka, pulling on snow boots and thick gloves, she felt like an astronaut preparing for a spacewalk into a hostile world. She grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from its hook by the door. Her hand hesitated on the deadbolt. This was it. The moment the story of her quiet month in the mountains could turn into something else entirely. With a deep breath that tasted of fear and resolve, she turned the lock. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it back against the wall. A wave of ice and snow surged into the cabin, instantly stealing the warmth. The fire hissed and shrank. Sarah fought her way onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind her. The cold was a physical blow, a stunning, brutal force that drove the air from her lungs. The flashlight beam cut a weak, trembling path through the blizzard. She squinted her eyes, watering against the wind. The shape was still there, maybe 50 yards away. She plunged off the porch, the snow instantly swallowing her up to her knees. Each step was a monumental effort, a battle against the storm's immense, indifferent power. As she got closer, the shape resolved into the form of a man. He was lying face down, a dark silhouette in a world of white. A deep, irrational fear pulsed through her. This was how horror movies began. The lone girl in the isolated cabin, the mysterious stranger the coming night. But as she drew nearer, she saw the reason for his stillness. A dark, ugly stain was spreading from beneath him, melting the snow in a sickening, almost black pool. Blood, her breath hitched. All thoughts of horror movies vanished, replaced by a stark, terrifying reality. She fell to her knees beside him, the flashlight beam shaking wildly. "Hey, can you hear me?" she yelled over the wind. With numb fingers, she reached out and grabbed his shoulder, rolling him over. The man was young, maybe 30. His face was all sharp angles and stark beauty, even pale and slack as it was. A gash high on his temple was matted with blood, but it was the dark, spreading stain on his abdomen that held her horrified gaze. He was dressed in a thin, tailored black coat, utterly inadequate for the weather now soaked and torn. His eyes fluttered open. For a second, they were unfocused, lost. Then they locked onto hers. They were the darkest green she had ever seen, like a forest at midnight. There was no fear in them, only a cold, shocking intensity. His lips moved a faint rasp against the storm's roar. No hospitals. He breathed the words barely a ghost of a sound. No police. And then his eyes rolled back, and the fierce light within them was extinguished. He was a dead weight in her arms, a dying stranger in the heart of a blizzard. And her silence, her sanctuary, had just been shattered forever. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It cleared Sarah's mind with the brutal efficiency of an ice storm. Dragging him was an exercise in futility. He was a dead weight of muscle and soaked wool. Adrenaline, raw and potent, surged through her veins. She couldn't lift him. Instead, she hooked her arms under his, planting her boots in the deep snow, and pulled. She dragged him backward, one desperate slipping step at a time, a small, determined tugboat against a sinking ship. The wind was a physical enemy trying to tear him from her grasp, plastering her hair across her face, blinding her. The 20 feet from where he'd fallen to the relative shelter of the porch felt like a mile. His head lulled, leaving a faint, dark smear on the snow with every yard she gained. The metallic scent of his blood, sharp and alarming, mingled with the clean, cold smell of the blizzard. By the time she hauled him onto the wooden planks of the porch, her lungs were burning and her muscles screamed in protest. Getting him inside was another battle. She managed to open the door and with a final Herculean effort, dragged him over the threshold onto the braided rug. The storm and the silence were now locked inside with her. She slammed the door shut, the deadbolt clicking into place with a sound of grim finality. The cabin, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. For a moment, she just stood there, gasping for breath, her heart racing like a trapped bird against her ribs. The man lay on her floor, a bleeding, unconscious tear in the fabric of her quiet world. His dark hair was dusted with snow that was already beginning to melt, his pale skin a stark contrast to the crimson soaking through his shirt. What had she done? She had brought violence and danger into her home. His last words echoed in her head. A command, not a plea. No hospitals, no police. Shaking, she knelt beside him. She wasn't a doctor, not even close. Her first aid knowledge came from a single mandatory course in college, but leaving him to bleed out on her floor was not an option. Her hands trembled as she unbuttoned his fine black coat. It was ruined. A single neat hole punched through the abdomen, the fabric around it stiff with frozen blood. Beneath it, a white shirt was stained a gruesome blossoming red. She needed to see the wound to apply pressure. With fumbling fingers, she worked the shirt free from his waistband. And that's when she saw it. Tucked into his trousers, cold and menacing against his skin, was a gun. It wasn't a hunting rifle. It was a sleek black semi-automatic pistol, heavy and lethally efficient. Her blood ran cold. The sight of it was a confirmation of every fear she'd been trying to suppress. This man wasn't a lost hiker or a victim of a simple accident. He was from a world of gunshots in the dark, a world that operated under the clandestine rule of no police, a world she wanted no part of. Her first instinct was to back away to run and lock herself in the bedroom, but his breathing was shallow, a faint rattling sound in his chest. Leaving him to die felt like pulling the trigger herself. With a resolve that surprised her, she forced herself to move. She carefully, gingerly removed the weapon, her fingers recoiling from the cold steel as if it were burning hot. She placed it on the far side of the kitchen counter, as far from him and her as possible. Then she turned back to the task at hand. She fetched the professor's first aid kit, a reassuringly large and well-stocked box. Inside, she found gauze pads, antiseptic wipes, and rolls of bandages. Ripping open his shirt, she finally saw the wound. It was a nasty, ragged hole just above his hip. It was still weeping blood, but it didn't seem to be pumping, which she vaguely remembered was a good sign. No exit wound she could see. The bullet was still inside him. A wave of nausea washed over her, but she swallowed it down. Her hands slick with a mixture of melted snow, and his blood were clumsy. She cleaned the area as best she could with the antiseptic wipes, her touch surprisingly gentle. The man didn't stir, save for a low groan that vibrated through his chest. She packed the wound with a thick wad of gauze, pressing down hard. He flinched, a testament to the life still clinging to him. She held the pressure, her own body aching with the strain, counting the seconds, then the minutes, until the bleeding seemed to slow to a sluggish ooze. She worked quickly, then wrapping his abdomen tightly with bandages, her movements becoming more confident, more practiced with each pass. She found the gash on his temple and cleaned it too, taping a neat white square over the wound. Finally, she stripped off his soaked coat and shoes, covering him with every blanket she could find in the cabin. She collapsed into the armchair by the fire, exhausted and trembling, her clothes stained with his blood. The gun on the counter seemed to watch her, a silent, grim sentinel. The man Diego, she would later learn, lay by her hearth, a dangerous secret she now owned. The blizzard howled outside, sealing them in two strangers bound by a gunshot and a storm. Hours crept by. Sarah didn't sleep. She sat vigil, watching the steady, shallow rise and fall of his chest, stoking the fire, and fighting the terrifying thoughts that swirled in her mind. Who was he? Who had shot him? And most importantly, were they still out there in the storm, looking for him? Every creak of the cabin, every shriek of the wind sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She had saved a man's life, but in doing so, she felt with chilling certainty that she had just forfeited her own. As dawn approached, painting the snow-choked windows in shades of bruised purple and gray, his eyes opened again. This time, they were clear. The green was sharp, intelligent, and utterly focused. He took in the room in a single, sweeping glance. The fire, the drawn curtains, the gun on the counter, and finally, Sarah huddled in the chair. His gaze pinned her, and there was no gratitude in it, only assessment, only control. The phone line. He said, his voice a raw, growly whisper, but the command was absolute. "Did you cut it?" Sarah stared at him, the frayed cord of the old-fashioned telephone in her hand. The plastic was brittle with age, and it had snapped with a pathetic crunch under the force of the kitchen shears. The act felt shockingly final, a physical severing of her last tie to the normal world. Outside, the blizzard had begun to relent, its fury fading into a weary whispering wind. The silence that returned was different now, heavy, watchful, and filled with the presence of the dangerous man propped up against her sofa. "It's cut," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She refused to let the tremor in her hands betray her. His dark green eyes stayed on her, intense and unnervingly perceptive. He had pushed himself into a sitting position, his face a pale mask of pain, but his posture radiated an authority that defied his injuries. "Your name, Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah," he repeated, testing the sound. He gestured with his chin toward the gun on the counter. "Do you know how to use that?" "No," she answered quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I've never touched a gun in my life." A flicker of something. Relief. Amusement crossed his features before it was gone. "Good. Leave it where it is." He surveyed the small cabin again, his gaze lingering on the single door and the snow-blocked windows. "How long has the storm been like this?" "It started yesterday afternoon. It's been a whiteout for at least 12 hours. No one's getting up or down this mountain until the plows come through. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after." He seemed to process this, a muscle tightening in his jaw. He was trapped. They were trapped. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. He tried to shift his weight, and a sharp hiss of pain escaped his lips. His hand went to the bandages on his abdomen, which were already showing a small, dark bloom of fresh blood. "You need a real doctor," she said, taking a half step toward him. "I did what I could, but the bullet is still in there. You'll get an infection. You could die." "I'm aware," he said, his voice tight. "But a hospital is a morgue for me right now. It's the first place they would look. They, the faceless, nameless threat that had left him for dead in the snow." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. "Who are they? Who did this to you?" He looked at her, and for the first time his expression was not one of command or assessment, but of something akin to regret. "You're better off not knowing. You saved my life, Sarah Mitchell. I won't repay you by putting a target on your back. You think it's not already there." She shot back a spark of anger cutting through her fear. "I brought you into this house. Your blood is on my floor. Whoever is looking for you knows you're not dead. Where do you think they'll look next?" Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the cabin, a low, powerful thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of engines, multiple engines approaching steadily. It wasn't the distant, grinding noise of a snowplow. This was something else, something professional and purposeful. Diego's entire demeanor changed. The pain was gone from his face, replaced by a mask of cold, lethal focus. He reached for the sofa, trying to pull himself to his feet. "Get away from the windows," he ordered, his voice a low growl. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled to the far side of the room, her heart pounding against her ribs. She watched Diego, who was now struggling to stand, his hand pressed against his bleeding side. He was a wounded animal, but an animal that was still very much a predator. Through the window, she saw them, two black, monolithic SUVs, their tires churning through the deep snow, coming to a halt in the clearing. They were built for this kind of terrain, for this kind of work. Men began to emerge far from each vehicle. They moved with a silent, disciplined efficiency that was terrifying to behold. They were dressed in tactical gear, dark shapes against the pristine white, and they were all carrying automatic weapons. They weren't here to ask questions. One of the men approached the cabin, his movements fluid and cautious. Sarah held her breath, expecting the door to be kicked in, expecting a hail of gunfire. Instead, there was a series of quiet, deliberate knocks. Thump, 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 thump. A code. Diego let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. "It's my men," he said, sinking back onto the sofa, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Open the door." Sarah hesitated, her mind screaming at the absurdity of it. Let them in. Let this small cabin be filled with more guns, more danger. Diego's gaze met hers, hard as emerald ice. "Open it, Sarah." They're the only reason you and I are going to stay alive for the next hour." Her feet felt like lead, but she moved to the door and unbolted it. The man who stood on the porch was tall and lean with a severe face and eyes that missed nothing. He looked past her, his gaze immediately finding Diego. "Boss," he said, relief and concern wearing in his voice. He and another man brushed past Sarah, their focus entirely on their leader. "Marco," Diego acknowledged, his voice strained. "Vargas, he thinks you're dead." Marco reported, kneeling to inspect Diego's wound. "His team reported 2 shots confirmed you went down. The storm covered their tracks and kept them from retrieving the body. We have a medic on the way." He glanced around the cabin, his cold eyes finally settling on Sarah. "What about her?" The question hung in the air, clinical and sharp. "What about her?" As if she were a piece of furniture, a complication to be dealt with. "She saved my life," Diego said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "She stays. She's under my protection." Marco's expression didn't change, but his eyes conveyed a clear message to his boss. "She's a liability, a civilian who has seen your face, seen you weak." He stood up and spoke, his voice low, and for Diego's ears only. But in the small cabin, Sarah heard every word. "Diego, she's a loose end. We can't. She is not a loose end." Diego cut him off, his voice quiet, but ringing with absolute command. He looked straight at Sarah, his gaze locking with hers, and for the first time she felt the full, terrifying weight of his world settle upon her. "She's with me now. Her safety is our priority. No one touches her. No one questions her. Understand?" Marco gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. "Und?" He turned to Sarah, his eyes still cold, still assessing. "You will not leave this cabin. You will not contact anyone. You will do exactly as you are told. Your life depends on it. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact." Sarah looked from the impassive face of his soldier to the intense, exhausted face of the man she had pulled from the snow. She had opened her door to a stranger, and in doing so, had walked into a prison. The blizzard had ended, but she had never been more trapped. The hours that followed were a surreal invasion. A man introduced as the medic arrived, a quiet, serious individual who moved with the same unnerving competence as the others. He set up his equipment on the professor's antique coffee table, transforming the cozy living room into a makeshift operating theater. Marco and another guard helped move Diego onto the long dining table, his makeshift bed. Sarah was politely but firmly relegated to the kitchen, a spectator in her own borrowed home. She watched her stomach churning as the medic worked under a bright portable lamp, cutting away her clumsy bandages. She could hear the low murmur of their voices, the sharp clinical clink of metal instruments. She expected Diego to cry out in pain as the medic probed the wound, but he only remained stoically silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes closed. After what felt like an eternity, the medic announced, "The bullet is out. Clean pass. Missed the vital organs. He's lucky." He glanced over at Sarah, his gaze softening for the first time. "Your pressure dressing probably saved his life, bought him the time he needed." The validation was a strange, hollow comfort. She had saved him only to hand him back to this world of silent, armed men. While the medic stitched Diego up and administered a powerful antibiotic and painkiller via IV, Marco and his team swept the cabin. They moved through the small space with an eerie coordinated grace, checking for listening devices, securing the windows, and setting up a perimeter in the now subsiding snow. They spoke in low-clipped Italian, their words of foreign, menacing rhythm in the quiet air Sarah cherished. They violated her silence, her solitude, their dark gear and cold weapons, a brutalist intrusion on the cabin's rustic charm. Eventually, Diego, now pale and slick with sweat but stabilized, was moved back to the sofa. The IV stand stood beside him like a strange metallic tree. Marco approached Sarah, his face an impassive mask. "We need to dispose of his clothes, they're evidence." He gestured to the bloody torn pile on the floor. Sarah simply nodded, not trusting herself to speak. It was a simple request, a practical one, but it felt deeply personal. Those clothes were the last remnants of the stranger she'd found before he became Diego the boss. She gathered the ruined garments, the fabric still cold and damp. As she lifted the fine wool coat, something heavy slid from an inner pocket and fell to the floor with a soft metallic clink. Marco's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes sharp with suspicion. Sarah bent down and picked it up before he could. It was a tarnished silver flask, ornately engraved with a crest she didn't recognize. A snarling wolf's head framed by olive branches. It was old, the kind of heirloom passed down through generations. She felt a strange pull toward it, a faint, inexplicable echo of familiarity. She handed it to Marco along with the clothes, and he took them outside to be burned. The day bled into a long, tense evening. The men worked in quiet shifts, one always watching the treen, another monitoring a small, sophisticated radio. They ignored her completely, yet their presence was a constant, suffocating weight. Diego drifted in and out of a medicated sleep. In his moments of lucidity, his eyes would find her a silent, unreadable question in their green depths. Unable to settle, Sarah found herself drawn to the small attic, a place she hadn't yet explored. It was the one part of the cabin Diego's men hadn't swept. She needed a moment of peace, a space that was still hers. The attic was dusty and smelled of old paper and cedar. It was filled with the professor's academic life, boxes of research notes, stacks of journals, forgotten dissertations, and in the corner, a single small wooden footlocker she had brought with her from her apartment. It contained the few things she had left of her father. He had been a quiet man, an accountant who loved books and history, who had died in a mundane workplace accident when she was 16. Her memories of him were gentle, scholarly, and utterly ordinary. She ran her hand over the lid of the book, a wave of grief and nostalgia washing over her. She hadn't opened it in years. On a whim driven by a need to connect with a simpler, safer past, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside were his favorite books, a worn, leather-bound journal filled with his neat, precise handwriting, and a small velvet bag. She opened the bag and tipped its contents into her palm, a pair of silver cufflinks, his reading glasses, and a heavy, ornate skeleton key. It was also silver tarnished with age, and engraved at its head was the crest, a snarling wolf's head framed by olive branches. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The world tilted, the dusty attic air suddenly thin and hard to breathe. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a common design, perhaps. But her archivist's mind, trained to see patterns and connections, knew it was no coincidence. The lines were too precise, the details too specific. It was identical to the crest on the flask. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her quiet, bookish father, the man who had taught her to love history, had a connection to the violent, mysterious man sleeping by her fire. The thought was so ludicrous, so impossible, that she almost laughed, but there was no humor in it, only a cold, creeping dread. She left the key and hurried back downstairs. The cabin was quiet. The guards were changing shifts. Diego was asleep, his breathing deep, and even now his face relaxed in the flickering firelight. He looked younger, almost vulnerable. A dark, tarnished chain was visible against the pale skin of his neck, tucked beneath the collar of the fresh t-shirt one of his men had dressed him in. She'd noticed it before, but hadn't thought anything of it. Now she had to know. Her movements were stealthy, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the sudden deafening silence. She knelt beside him, the warmth from the fire on her back. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the chain. It was cold against her skin. Carefully, she drew it out from under his shirt. Hanging from the chain was a silver medallion worn smooth with time, and engraved on its surface, stark and undeniable in the firelight, was the same snarling wolf, the same olive branches. It wasn't just a family crest on a flask. It was something he wore close to his heart. Sarah sank back on her heels, the medallion still clutched in her hand, its cold reality a stark contrast to the warmth of his skin. The two worlds, her forgotten past and her terrifying present, had just collided with the force of an avalanche. Her father was not who she thought he was, and Diego Santini was not just a stranger she had saved. He was a ghost from a life she never knew existed, a life that had, it seemed, finally come to claim her. Sarah didn't let go of the medallion. Its cold, solid weight was an anchor in the dizzying vortex of her thoughts. She knelt there in the firelight, the silence of the cabin stretching thin until the first rays of dawn pierced the gray gloom. Diego stirred, his brow furrowed in pain. The powerful painkillers were wearing off. His eyes opened first, scanning the room with a predator's instinct, then settling on her. He saw the chain in her hand leading from his neck, and his entire body went rigid. "What are you doing?" His voice was low, laced with a new, dangerous edge. Instead of answering, Sarah opened her other hand. In her palm lay her father's key, its wolf crest a perfect damning twin to the one on his medallion. She held them out together, the two silver artifacts gleaming in the morning light, connecting two desperate lives across a chasm of 20 years. "My father's name was Michael Mitchell," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He was an accountant. He loved history and rare books. He died in a factory accident. That's the story I've known my whole life." "I think you're about to tell me that story was a lie." Diego stared at the key, then at her face. The mask of the calculating boss fell away, replaced by a look of profound, staggering shock. He pushed himself up, ignoring the sharp protest of his wound. He took the key from her, his fingers brushing hers, and the brief contact was like a jolt of electricity. He studied it, his thumb tracing the familiar lines of the crest. Michelle. He breathed the name, a ghost on his lips. Michelle. The Italian name meant nothing to Sarah, yet it struck her with the force of a physical blow. "Who is that?" "He was your father," Diego said, his green eyes locking onto hers, filled with a gravity that stole the air from her lungs. "And he was my father's most trusted friend, his concierge." The words, spoken in quiet reverence, sent a chill down her spine. The world of movies and novels had just crashed into her reality. A consigliere, an advisor to a crime boss. My father was Antonio Santini. Diego continued, his voice raw with the weight of memory. He was the head of an organization that valued honor and loyalty above all else. We called ourselves the Veo Lupo, the Old Wolf. That crest was our mark. It signified family protection. He gestured around the violated cabin, a bitter irony in his expression. Your father, Michel, was the keeper of our history and our secrets. He held the ledgers. Il Libro Mastro, the book that detailed every transaction, every alliance, every betrayal. He paused, the silence in the room heavy with unspoken violence. 22 years ago, there was a coup. A man named Ricardo Vargas, my father's underboss, grew greedy. He dealt in narcotics and human misery, things my father forbade. He staged an ambush. Diego's gaze became distant, lost in a memory of fire and blood. My father was killed. Many loyal men died that night. Your father was there. He fought, but he was a scholar, not a soldier. When all was lost, he did the one thing he could. He saved my father's legacy. He saved me. Sarah sank into the armchair, her legs unable to support her. I was 8 years old, Diego said. Michel grabbed me, and he grabbed the ledgers. He disappeared into the chaos. He got me to loyalists in the north who raised me in hiding. Then he vanished. He changed his name, created a new life, and became Michael Mitchell, a quiet accountant in Billings, Montana. He buried himself to protect the book and to protect you. Every gentle memory she had of her father was now recast in a grim new light. His quiet nature wasn't shyness, it was concealment. His obsession with history wasn't a hobby, it was a connection to a life he'd been forced to abandon, and his death. The accident, she whispered. It wasn't an accident, was it? Diego's expression was grim. Vargas has been hunting for those ledgers, and for me ever since that night. The ledgers are the proof of his treason. They also contain the keys to the old family accounts, the legitimate assets he could never touch. He would do anything to find them. Killing your father would have been a loose end he was more than willing to tie up. The truth was a poison seeping into every cherished memory, corrupting everything. So the attack on you, it was him, Vargas. Yes, I have spent the last 10 years rebuilding my father's organization, taking back what is ours piece by piece. I have become a threat Vargas can no longer ignore. He tried to eliminate me in the storm, and now he looked at her, and she saw the terrible weight of his next words in his eyes. Now he knows I failed, and through me he has found you. You are the daughter of Michelle Mielo. Vargas will believe, and he is likely right that you are the key to finding those ledgers. He stood pacing the small space between the hearth and the counter, the wounded predator now caged and furious. You are not a liability, Sarah. You are the single most valuable target in Vargas's world. You are in more danger than you can possibly imagine. He stopped in front of her, his presence overwhelming. He knelt so his eyes were level with hers, forcing her to see the absolute certainty in his gaze. Which leaves you with a choice. He said, his voice low and intense. A choice you must make now. He held up one hand. Option 1, you run. I will give you a new name, a new identity, and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. My men will get you out of the country tonight. You will disappear, but know this. Vargas is a patient, relentless hunter. He will look for you. You will spend every day of your life wondering if the new friend you made the stranger who smiled at you on the street is one of his. You will be free, but you will never be safe, and you will be completely, utterly alone. He held up his other hand. Option 2, you stay. You stay with me. You are the daughter of my father's concierge. By blood and by honor, you have a place in my family. We will find the ledgers your father hid. Together with them, I can destroy Vargas from the inside out and reclaim what he stole. As long as you are by my side, I will protect you with every bullet, every dollar I possess. I swear on my father's grave no harm will come to you. He paused, his gaze searching hers, demanding her understanding. But you will be a part of my world. The violence, the fear, the darkness, it will be yours too. You will not be free. But I promise you, you will be safe, and you will not be alone. The two choices hung in the air, both impossible, both terrifying. Flee into a life of lonely paranoia or step into a cage of violent protection. It was the choice between a life of running from ghosts or a life of standing with a monster. Her father's past had finally caught up with her, and the price of his secrets was a choice that would define not only her future, but whether she would have one at all. Sarah looked at Diego, his face etched with a grim intensity, his world of violence and honor laid bare before her. The two choices he offered were not choices at all. They were two different kinds of prisons. One was a life sentence of solitary confinement spent in the cold terror of being hunted. The other was a gilded cage shared with a predator where the bars were made of loyalty and the cost of safety was freedom. Her father had spent 20 years in the first prison. He had run hidden and erased himself, all to protect a secret, to protect her. He had lived a half-life of quiet paranoia, and in the end, it hadn't saved him. The ghosts of the past had found him anyway. A sudden, fierce clarity cut through Sarah's fear. She would not inherit his prison. She would not spend her life looking over her shoulder, flinching at shadows. If her father's past was to be her future, she would face it head-on. "I won't run," she said, her voice resonating with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The decision once made settled in her bones like steel. "My father lived in fear. He died because of it." I refused to do the same. She met Diego's gaze, her own unwavering. "You said, I have a place in your family by blood. You said my father was a man of honor. If I'm going to be hunted because of his legacy, then I want to know what that legacy is. I want to know the man he truly was." She took a deep breath. "I'll stay. I'll help you find the ledgers." A complex array of emotions flickered across Diego's face. Grim respect, profound relief, and something softer, something that looked almost like admiration. Marco, standing silently by the door, remained impassive, but Sarah could feel his disapproval, like a drop in temperature. "You understand what this means," Diego stated. Not as a question, but as a final warning. "There is no going back from this. Vargas will see you as an enemy, not just a target." "I understand," she said. "I'm a librarian, Mr. Santini. My entire life has been about uncovering the truth from the past. It seems my own has finally caught up with me." For the first time since he'd woken up, a genuine ghost of a smile touched Diego's lips. "Diego," he corrected her. "If we are to do this, my name is Diego." "Sarah," she replied, a silent pact passing between them. The dynamic in the room had shifted. She was no longer just the civilian he had saved. She was an asset, an ally, the keeper of a history he desperately needed. "All right," Diego said, his focus shifting back to business, the commander taking over once more. He winced as he pushed himself to a more stable position on the sofa. "The ledgers. Your father would have hidden them somewhere only he or someone who thought like him could find. We start with what he left behind. The footlocker." Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through her. The box she had opened only hours ago, seeking comfort in the past, now held the key to her future. "It's in the attic." Marco immediately moved to retrieve it, but Diego stopped him with a raised hand. "No, Sarah and I will do this." His gaze held a silent message for his lieutenant. "This is a matter of family. She is to be trusted." Marco gave a curt nod and stepped back, resuming his silent watch. Sarah led the way to the attic stairs. Diego followed, moving stiffly, his hand never far from his wounded side. The attic was cold, the air thick with the dust of forgotten things. In the pale morning light, the small wooden box seemed both ordinary and immensely significant. Together, they knelt before it. It felt strangely intimate, two strangers bound by the secrets of the dead. Diego's presence beside her was a tangible thing, a field of contained energy and pain. She could smell the faint scent of antiseptic, and something else, something uniquely him. Sandalwood and cold mountain air. She opened the lid. Inside, the familiar contents seemed different now, artifacts from a secret life. Diego watched as she carefully lifted out her father's old books. He picked one up, a leather-bound volume on the history of the Medici family, and ran his hand over the cover. Michel loved history. He said, his voice quiet. "My father used to say he could win a war with a book, not a bullet. He believed knowledge was the only true power." Sarah's heart ached. This was a side of her father she had never known, yet it felt deeply, intrinsically true. She reached for the worn journal. He wrote in this every day, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I always thought it was just notes for his reading. She handed it to Diego. He opened it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. The script was her father's neat, precise, almost architectural, but the text itself was a confounding mix of historical dates, astronomical charts, and quotes from obscure Renaissance poetry. It's a code, Diego said, a note of frustration in his voice. Michel was brilliant. He wouldn't have made it simple. Sarah took the journal back, her archivist's instincts kicking in. It wasn't just a random code. It was a system, a narrative. It's not random, she murmured, tracing a line of text with her finger. He's using historical analogies. Each entry corresponds to a date, but the notes aren't about that day. They're about an event in the past that mirrors something happening in his present. She flipped through the pages, her mind racing, connecting the dots. He's telling a story. His story. She stopped at an entry dated a week before his death. The entry itself was simple. A quote from a letter by a 15th-century Florentine banker. All that I have I entrust to the queen who was sacrificed for a crown she never wore. Diego read the line over her shoulder. What the hell does that mean? But Sarah wasn't listening. Her eyes were wide, her mind spinning back to a memory, a story her father used to tell her as a little girl, a history lesson disguised as a fairy tale. And Berlin, she whispered, her voice filled with dawning realization. The second wife of Henry VIII. He called her the queen who was sacrificed. He was fascinated by her. He had a book, a rare first edition biography of her. Diego looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. He hid it in a book. It has to be, she said, a frantic energy seizing her. The book is in here. She dug through the footlocker, her hands searching for the familiar dark green binding. At the very bottom, beneath a stack of old photographs, she found it. It was heavy, the pages thick and brittle with age. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The book was hollowed out and nestled inside, wrapped in oil, and sealed with wax was not a ledger, but a small black object made of metal and plastic, a hard drive. Diego let out a sharp, ragged breath. Of course, her father was too smart for paper. A digital record encrypted and easily hidden. This was it. The legacy, the weapon, the key to everything. He looked from the hard drive to Sarah's face, her expression a mixture of awe and terror. He won a war with a book after all, Diego said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. He knew in that moment that the quiet librarian kneeling beside him was more than just the daughter of his father's friend. She was the only weapon he had that Vargas would never see coming. The air in the attic was thick with the dust of the past and the electric hum of the present. The hard drive lay in Diego's palm, a small, dense object that felt heavier than it should, weighted with the secrets of two families. For a moment, they just stared at it, the final legacy of a brilliant hunted man. This changes everything, Diego said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Sarah, his eyes burning with a new fierce intensity. Your father has given us the sword. Now we just have to figure out how to wield it. He snapped back into commander mode, his mind already 3 steps ahead. Marco! He yelled, his voice echoing down the attic stairs. His lieutenant was there in seconds, his face a study in professional readiness. Diego held up the hard drive. This is it, Libro Mastro. We're moving out now. Marco's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He nodded once. The convoy will be ready in 10 minutes. The storm has passed, but the roads will be treacherous. I don't like moving you while you're still injured. I don't have a choice, Diego countered, using the wall to push himself to his feet. Vargas may think I'm dead, but he's not a fool. He'll have men sweeping this mountain range as soon as it's passable. The cabin is compromised. We leave. He turned to Sarah. Pack only what's yours. We're burning the rest. The command was brutal but necessary. Any trace of their presence, any clue left behind could be a weapon against them. While Diego's men prepped the vehicles, Sarah moved through the cabin in a daze gathering the few belongings she'd brought. The books, the warm sweaters, the half-empty mug of tea on the nightstand. They all belonged to a life that had ceased to exist the moment she saw a splash of red against the snow. She packed her father's footlocker with reverent care. It was no longer a box of memories, it was an arsenal. 10 minutes later, she was escorted out into the cold, bright light of the morning after. The world was transformed, draped in a blanket of pristine, untouched snow. The beauty of it was a cruel joke against the grim reality of the scene. The two black SUVs were idling their engines, a low, powerful growl. Diego's men, armed and alert, formed a protective cordon around them. Diego was already in the back of the lead vehicle, his face pale and tight with pain. Marco held the door for Sarah. "You ride with him." The interior of the SUV was a cocoon of black leather and tinted bulletproof glass. It smelled of power and money. Sarah slid in opposite Diego the hard drive, now in a specialized padded case on the seat between them. As the convoy pulled away, she looked back at the small log cabin, her sanctuary. One of Diego's men was walking toward it with a can of gasoline. She turned away, her throat tight, and didn't look back as a plume of dark smoke began to rise against the clean white landscape. The journey down the mountain was a tense, silent affair. The SUVs handled the snow-clogged roads with an unnerving ease, their powerful engines never straining. Sarah clutched her father's journal, her mind already working, trying to decipher the coded language, searching for a key to the secrets locked within the hard drive. Diego watched her, his expression unreadable. The initial surge of adrenaline had faded, leaving him looking exhausted and vulnerable. The lines of pain around his eyes were deeper, and he leaned his head back against the leather, his breathing carefully controlled. "He wrote about you," Sarah said quietly, not looking up from the journal. Diego's eyes opened. "What in here?" She tapped the book. "Not by name. He calls you the wolf cub. He writes about getting you to safety, about how you had your father's eyes." A lump formed in her throat. He wrote that protecting you was the last act of honor he could perform for his friend. He loved you. An emotion she couldn't decipher passed over Diego's face. He was silent for a long time, watching the snow-laden pines flash past the window. "My memories of him are fragmented," he finally said, his voice rough, fear running the smell of smoke. "But I remember his hands. They were scholars' hands like yours, always gentle. He read to me from books on history and strategy. Even when we were hiding in a cellar, he was preparing me." He looked at her. He was the only father I ever really knew. The confession was an offering, a moment of shared grief that bridged the gap between their two worlds. In that moment, he wasn't a crime boss, and she wasn't a civilian. They were just two orphans bound by the legacy of the men who had loved them. As the convoy reached the valley floor and picked up speed on the cleared highway, Diego's head slumped to the side, his body finally succumbing to the trauma and exhaustion. His head came to rest almost imperceptibly against her shoulder. She froze, every muscle tensed. His men in the front seats, separated by a thick glass partition, didn't seem to notice. He was asleep, his breathing a soft, warm puff against her neck. She should have moved. She should have pushed him away, re-established the boundary between them. But she didn't. He was so still, so unguarded. The man who had faced down assassins, who commanded an army, was now relying on her for the small moments of comfort. Her hand of its own accord came up to rest on his arm, a silent protective gesture. He didn't stir. They rode the rest of the way in silence, a strange temporary peace settling between them in the heart of the armored beast, carrying them toward an unknown war. An hour later, they turned off the main road, passing through a set of imposing iron gates that opened silently for them. They drove down a long, winding lane, flanked by ancient pines, until the house came into view. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress, a sprawling stone and glass mansion that seemed to rise organically from the mountainside. Its architecture a seamless blend of modern fortification and old-world elegance. It was surrounded by a high, formidable wall with discreetly placed cameras and guard towers visible at the corners. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking, a testament to generations of power and wealth. The convoy rolled to a stop in a wide cobblestone courtyard. Marco opened their door. "Welcome to the Santini estate, Miss Mitchell. We're secure here." Diego stirred, lifting his head from her shoulder. The moment of vulnerability was gone. His eyes were sharp again as he took in his surroundings. He looked at her, his expression giving nothing away, but she felt the phantom warmth of his head on her shoulder, the brief, fragile connection they had shared. Now he set his gaze dropping to the hard drive, then to the journal in her lap. The real work begins. Sarah stepped out of the SUV and into the heart of Diego Santini's power. The mountain cabin had been a cage, but this was a different world entirely. A world where she was now a willing prisoner, and the only way out was through the secrets locked inside her father's legacy. The interior of the Santini estate was a world of muted elegance and cold, hard power. Marble floors gleamed under coffered ceilings, and priceless art hung on walls of polished stone. It was vast, silent, and immaculate. But beneath the opulent surface, Sarah felt the thrum of a finely tuned machine. Every corner was covered by a discreet camera. Every window was visibly reinforced, and the few staff members she saw moved with a quiet difference that bordered on fear. This wasn't a home. It was a headquarters. A woman in a crisp black uniform named Sophia escorted her to a suite of rooms in the East Wing. The suite was larger than her entire apartment in Billings. It had a sitting room with a fireplace, a bedroom with a king-sized bed, and a marble bathroom with a tub overlooking the snow-covered mountains. It was the most beautiful cage she had ever seen. "Mr. Santini has instructed that you are to have anything you need, Miss Mitchell." Sophia said, her voice polite but devoid of warmth. "Your father's belongings have been brought to the study adjoining this room." Alone, Sarah walked through the suite. A fire was already laid in the hearth. Fresh clothes in her size were folded neatly on the bed. They had thought of everything. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was a guest, a partner in a dangerous secret, but she was also a specimen under a microscope. Her needs anticipated and managed by a silent, efficient organization. She was no longer her own. An hour later, after a brief, restless attempt to settle in, Marco appeared at her door. "Diego is asking for you. We're ready to begin." He led her not to an office, but to a room in the subtle of the estate that felt more like a NORAD command center. The war room, as she would come to call it, was a stark contrast to the opulence above. It was a space of cool, functional purpose. A bank of monitors lined one wall displaying security feeds from across the property and encrypted data streams. In the center of the room, a large glass-topped conference table was surrounded by high-tech computer terminals. Diego was already there, seated at the head of the table. He had changed into a simple gray sweater and dark trousers. The medic had redressed his wound, but he still looked pale. A young man with glasses and an intense, focused energy sat at one of the terminals, his fingers flying across a keyboard. Sarah Diego acknowledged, gesturing to the chair beside him. This is Leo, our head of technical operations. Leo, this is Ms. Mitchell. She is our key. Leo gave her a brief, curious glance before his attention snapped back to his screen. Boss. The drive is a custom builder set interface, but the casing is reinforced. And the encryption he let out a low whistle. It's not standard. It's a multi-layered custom algorithm. Brute forcing it is out of the question. It would take centuries. It's designed to self-corrupt after 3 failed password attempts. He was thorough. Diego murmured, his gaze on the hard drive now connected to the system by a mess of wires. He knew this day might come. He turned to Sarah. It's all on you. The key to this is in the journal. The pressure was immense. 3 men, a crime boss, and his top lieutenants were looking at her, their entire war effort hinging on her ability to solve a 20-year-old puzzle. She took a deep breath, opened her father's journal, and set it on the glass table. The ancient history and the modern technology sat side by side, 2 halves of the same secret. For the next several hours, they worked. The war room became their world. Sophia brought them food and strong black coffee that they barely touched. Sarah read aloud from the journal, her voice the only sound in the room, her mind sinking into the complex allegorical world her father had created. Diego listened, his focus absolute, occasionally providing a piece of context, a name, a place, a half-forgotten memory from his childhood that would suddenly illuminate a cryptic passage. Here, Sarah said, her finger tracing a line. He writes, "The transaction was concluded under the watchful eye of the weeping senator. It's dated the same week as a major shipment he mentions earlier." "The weeping senator," Diego repeated. A distant look in his eyes. He closed them, searching his memory. There was a statue in my father's old office in the city, a Roman bust. One of the eyes had a flaw in the marble. It looked like a teardrop. My father called it the weeping senator. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Vargas took that office. It's his now. Leo's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up blueprints of the VEC building downtown. And so it went for hours. Sarah, the historian, deciphering the riddles of the past. Diego, the heir providing the living memory, and Leo, the technician connecting it to the present. They were a strange, perfectly formed team. Marco stood by the door, a silent, brooding statue, watching the collaboration with an expression Sarah couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was something closer to awe. As night fell outside, they grew more exhausted, the air in the room thick with caffeine and tension. Sarah felt a strange sense of exhilaration. Her mind, so long accustomed to the quiet, dusty corners of history, was alive, firing on all cylinders and working beside Diego. It was intoxicating. He listened to her with a focused respect no one, not even her professors, had ever shown her. He didn't see a librarian. He saw a vital weapon. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same page. A jolt, small but potent, passed between them. Their eyes met over the ancient script, and for a heartbeat, the war. The danger, the ledgers, all of it faded away. There was only the charged space between them, the shared intensity, the unspoken acknowledgement of the strange, dangerous path they were now on together. Diego was the first to look away, clearing his throat. Keep going. Sarah's focus sharpened, fueled by a new urgency. She turned to one of the final entries written just days before her father's accident. It was the same quote she'd found before, but with an addendum. "All that I have I entrust to the queen who was sacrificed for a crown she never wore. Her story is the lock. Her final words are the key." Her final words, Sarah whispered, her mind racing. She knew the history by heart. Anne Boleyn's execution speech. It was famous. But what were her final words? Not the speech she gave to the crowd, but her last private utterances. According to one historical account, a letter from the constable of the tower, her last words whispered to her ladies in waiting were a simple, defiant prayer in Latin. She scribbled it on a notepad and pushed it toward Leo. Ado converto solacia. I turned to God. Grace is all that is left to me. It's a password, she said, her voice shaking with excitement. It has to be. Leo's fingers danced across the keyboard, typing the Latin phrase into the password field. It's long complex, it fits the parameters. He looked at Diego, his hand hovering over the enter key. Boss, we only get 3 tries. Diego didn't look at his technician. His eyes were fixed on Sarah, a silent question passing between them. He was trusting her completely. His entire future rested on her interpretation of a 500-year-old story. Sarah met his gaze and gave a single firm nod. Do it, Diego commanded. Leo hit the enter key. For a heart-topping second, the screen was blank. Then, with a soft electronic chime, the encryption layer vanished. A single folder appeared in the center of the screen. Its title was not Librostro. Its title was one word, Sarah. The single word glowed on the screen, stark and absolute against the dark interface. Sarah. The air in the war room was suddenly thin. Leo looked at Diego, his face a mask of confusion. Marco shifted his weight, a silent question in his posture. This was not the master ledger. This was something else, something personal. Open it, Sarah whispered the words, barely audible. Her father had left a final message, and it was addressed to her. Diego's gaze was fixed on her face, gauging her reaction. He saw the fear, the hope, the desperate need to know. He gave Leo a curt nod. Do it. With a click, the folder opened. It did not reveal rows of financial data or lists of criminal enterprises. Instead, a meticulously organized digital scrapbook of a life blossomed on the screen. Her life. There were hundreds of files, scanned photographs of a little girl with missing front teeth on her first day of school, a grainy video of her at a piano recital, her small hand stumbling through a simple melody, her high school graduation photo, her smile wide and oblivious, her college acceptance letter essays. She had written papers she had been proud of. It was a complete secret archive of her existence, curated with a father's loving, obsessive precision. He was always watching. She breathed a hand coming to her mouth. She remembered him at these events, a quiet, unassuming figure in the background with a camera. She had always thought it was just a father's hobby. Now she saw it for what it was. A man in hiding, desperately clinging to the life he could see, but never fully be a part of. Leo opened the financial subfolder. Diego commanded, his voice gentle, sensing the fragility of the moment. The screen shifted. This was not a scrapbook. This was a portfolio of staggering complexity and wealth. There were offshore accounts, shell corporations, and stock portfolios spread across a dozen countries. But as Leo scrolled through the files, a pattern emerged. It was a master-ass in money laundering executed over 2 decades. Small, untraceable investments properties bought and sold through layers of legal entities. Funds moved with the silent, patient precision of a grandmaster playing chess. What is this? Sarah asked, her voice faint. It's a ghost empire, Diego said, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. Your father didn't just hide the Santini fortune. He cleaned it. He invested it. He grew it. He looked at Sarah, the reality of it dawning on him. This isn't my family's money anymore, Sarah. It's yours. He put it all in your name. She was unknowingly, fantastically wealthy. The quiet librarian who worried about her savings account was the beneficiary of a financial empire built from the ashes of a fallen crime family. "There is one more file," Leo said, his voice hushed. "A video file for Sarah when the time is right." This was it. The final message. "Play it," she said, her throat tight. The image of her father flickered onto the main screen. He looked older than she remembered, the lines of stress and worry carved deep around his kind eyes. He was in his study, the one from their old house, the familiar background of books a painful nostalgic echo. He looked directly at the camera as if he could see her across the years. "My dearest Sarah," he began, his voice the same gentle scholarly tone she cherished but imbued with a new somber weight. "If you are watching this, it means the life I built for you has been breached. It means the past has found you, and for that, I am so sorry." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, silent and hot. "I raised you in ignorance because I wanted you to have a life free from the violence and fear that has haunted me," he continued. "I wanted you to be a scholar, a woman of books, not of blood. But I was a fool to think I could keep the ghosts away forever." He sighed, a heavy, tired sound. "The man who brought you this message, Diego Santini, he is the son of the man I failed. Antonio was my brother in all but blood. His death is a debt I have carried every day of my life. I saved his son, but I could not save his honor." His eyes seemed to plead with her through the screen. "The real ledgers, Elro, are on this drive. They are hidden, woven into the financial data. A second layer of code in my journal. You will find the ciphers. They are based on the historical patterns we so love to discuss. You, and only you, can unlock them." He leaned closer, his expression urgent. "This fortune, it is your power, Sarah. I built it for you so that you would never be helpless, so that you would have the resources to choose your own path. But it is also a weapon. With the ledgers, you can give Diego the proof he needs to legally dismantle Ricardo Vargas's empire, to expose him to his own allies as a traitor. You can give him back his father's name." His voice cracked with emotion. "This is a terrible burden to place on you, my daughter. My only wish was for your safety. But if that is no longer possible, then my wish is for your victory. Be brave. Be smart. Trust your instincts. And trust the wolf cub. He has his father's fire. Together you can restore the honor of our family." He reached out as if to touch the camera lens. "I love you more than words can say. Se forte Macara. Be strong, my dear." The screen went dark. The war room was utterly silent, save for Sarah's quiet sobs. The weight of her father's love, his sacrifice, and his final terrible request was crushing. She was not just a key to a puzzle. She was the designated heir to a war she never knew existed. Diego made a small, sharp gesture with his hand. Leo and Marco understood immediately. They gathered their things and exited the room, closing the heavy soundproof door behind them, leaving Sarah and Diego alone in the glow of the monitors. He didn't speak. He simply moved to the small bar in the corner of the room, poured a glass of water, and brought it to her. He knelt before her chair just as he had in the cabin and placed the cool glass in her trembling hands. "He loved you very much," Diego said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of grief. "Everything he did to protect you. He left me a battle to fight," she whispered, looking at the dark screen that had held her father's ghost. "No," Diego said, his gaze intense, his hand coming to rest on her arm, a gesture of profound, protective solidarity. "He left us a battle to fight, and now we have the map. You are not alone in this, Sarah. I promise you." She looked at him, then at this dangerous, violent man who was now the only person in the world who could understand the legacy she carried. His promise was not one of peace or of an easy life. It was a promise of allegiance, a promise to stand with her in the darkness her father had left behind. And in that moment, it was the only promise that mattered. The days that followed blurred into a single continuous stretch of time, marked only by the shifting light outside the war room's shielded windows and the dwindling stacks of coffee cups. The folder named Sarah was a Pandora's box of emotion that Sarah had to force herself to close for the moment, focusing instead on the monumental task her father had left her. The grief was a raw, open wound, but she funneled it along with her fear into a sharp, cold focus. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. Her father's coding system was a work of genius, a labyrinth of historical and literary references that would be impenetrable to anyone but her. She and Diego fell into a rhythm. She was the navigator, her mind delving into the intricate patterns of the journal. He was the living context, the keeper of the oral history that gave her clues, meaning. He mentions the fall of Constantinople, she'd murmur, tracing the script. But the corresponding financial entry is a land purchase in British Columbia. It makes no sense. Diego would lean closer, their shoulders brushing his presence, a constant warm weight beside her. He'd stare at the passage, his brow furrowed. Constantinople. The walls were breached at a forgotten gate. He'd say a distant memory surfacing. My father told Michelle a story once about a rival family who fell because of a secret entrance to their warehouse. A forgotten service tunnel. Leo's fingers would fly. Cross-referencing property records for the BC land purchase with city planning archives from the period. Got it. A defunct railway spur terminates on the property. That's the forgotten gate. It was like this for days. A cryptic poem about a Venetian doge would unlock a Swiss bank account. A reference to Caesar crossing the Rubicon would reveal a point of no return that exposed one of Vargas's shell corporations. They were unraveling a 20-year-old conspiracy, one historical metaphor at a time. In the long hours of the night when Leo and Marco had retired, leaving them alone in the quiet glow of the monitors, the professional partnership would fray at the edges, revealing something more vulnerable beneath. One night, while staring at a faded photograph of her father and a younger, smiling man she now knew was Antonio Santini, Diego spoke, his voice low. "I remember that day," he said. "It was at a picnic. Michelle had just finished telling me the story of the 300 Spartans. He said that honor was not about winning, but about standing your ground no matter the cost." He looked at her, his green eyes shadowed with an old, deep-seated pain. "He stood his ground for me. I never got to thank him." He knew Sarah said her own voice thick. He wrote in his journal that protecting you was the only thing that gave his life meaning after he lost her father. In the shared silence, the ghosts of their fathers seemed to fill the room, two loyal friends whose legacy now rested on the shoulders of their children. Diego reached out his fingers, gently brushing a stray tear from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, yet it sent a current of warmth through her that had nothing to do with grief. "You have his eyes," Diego whispered. "Not the color, the focus, the intelligence. When you're working, you look just like him." She couldn't breathe. His face was so close, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. This was insane. He was a crime boss, a killer, but he was also the only person who had looked at her and seen not a victim, but a partner. The only person who had made her feel not just safe, but powerful. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. The world narrowed to the space between them. A near kiss, a silent acknowledgement of the magnetic pull that had been growing since the moment he'd woken in her cabin. But at the last second, he pulled back, a muscle clenching in his jaw. "We should keep working," He said, his voice rough, turning back to the screens, as if they held the answer to a problem far simpler than the one between them. The moment was broken, but the charge remained a live wire, running just beneath the surface of every interaction. On the fifth day, they broke through the final layer. The true Libro MRO unspooled across the main monitor. It was everything Diego had hoped for, and more. A meticulous, undeniable record of Vargas's treachery. It detailed the secret narcotics deals he'd made behind Antonio's back, the accounts he'd used to siphon money, the names of the men he had paid to orchestrate the ambush that killed Diego's father. But it also contained something more valuable. Proof that Vargas had been systematically cheating his current partners, the South American cartel that supplied him. He had been skimming their profits for years, building his own separate empire. "My God," Leo breathed, staring at the screen. "This is a declaration of war." "No," Diego said, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. He looked at Sarah, his eyes alight with a dangerous, triumphant fire. "This isn't a declaration of war. This is the execution order. Your father didn't just give us a sword, Sarah. He gave us the guillotine." They finally had their weapon. The path to victory was clear. For the first time, an end was in sight. But as a new, unfamiliar hope began to dawn in Sarah's heart, she failed to notice the small red light blinking on Marco's secure phone, a silent harbinger of a storm, far more immediate and terrible than the one she had survived on the mountain. The discovery of the ledgers sent a surge of predatory energy through the estate. The atmosphere shifted from one of tense vigilance to coiled, focused preparation. Diego was a man transformed. The last traces of his physical weakness vanished, replaced by the chilling efficiency of a general on the eve of a decisive battle. He, Marco, and a select group of his captains spent hours in the war room using the information from the ledgers to map out Vargas's empire, identifying his weaknesses, his safe houses, his supply lines. Sarah watched from the periphery, her role as decipher now complete. She saw the man she had nursed back to health become the formidable crime boss his reputation suggested. He was ruthless, brilliant, and commanded absolute loyalty. And a part of her, a part she was terrified to acknowledge, found it breathtaking. She had found her own purpose, too, using the legitimate accounts her father had set up. And with Leo's technical guidance, she began to learn the art of financial warfare. She learned how to move assets, how to create untraceable firewalls, and how to use the vast fortune at her disposal as a weapon. She was no longer just an archivist. She was becoming the guardian of the Santini legacy in all its light and shadow. Their personal moments became stolen whispers in hallways, brief, intense glances across the war room table. The unspoken thing between them was a constant presence, a promise to be addressed once the war was over. For now, the mission consumed them. The plan was elegant in its brutality. They wouldn't just attack Vargas. They would dismantle his empire from within. Using the evidence of his betrayal, Diego would anonymously tip off Vargas's cartel partners. While the cartel turned on him, Diego's forces would strike. Not at Vargas himself, but at his financial heart, seizing the assets her father's ledgers had identified. It would be a swift two-front war, leaving Vargas isolated, penniless, and at the mercy of the very people he had cheated. They were 2 days from setting the plan in motion when Marco entered the war room, his face grim. He held a secure phone in his hand. "Diego, you need to see this." He placed the phone on the table. It displayed a single grainy image sent from an untraceable number. It was a photograph of a woman with warm, friendly eyes and a familiar smile tied to a chair in what looked like a damp cellar. A current newspaper was propped in her lap to show the date. Sarah's blood turned to ice. It was Clara, her former colleague from the city library, the only friend she had kept in casual contact with via email since leaving Billings. No, Sarah whispered, her legs giving way. Diego was there in an instant, his hands on her arms, holding her steady. The phone buzzed again. A text message appeared beneath the photo. The historian for the ledgers. A fair trade. You have 24 hours. The old shipping docks. Pier 4. Come alone. He knows. Diego snarled his voice, a low, dangerous growl. He knows it was you. How? Sarah stammered, her mind reeling. We've been secure. No one. He's been watching you for longer than we thought. Marco cut in, his face pale. He must have identified your contacts before you even came to the cabin. The trap was obvious. A desperate final move. Vargas had lost the strategic war, so he had resorted to the one tactic he had left. Emotional blackmail. He didn't want the ledgers anymore. He wanted revenge. He wanted Diego. And he was using Sarah's last connection to her old life as bait. I can't go alone, Diego said, his mind already calculating, the strategist overriding the man. It's an ambush. You can't trade Sarah Marco, protested, horrified. Never, Diego bit out the word, his grip tightening on Sarah's arms. He looked into her eyes, his own, a maelstrom of fury and a terrifying cold calm. He wants me. He'll get me, but on my terms. He turned to Marco. Pull the team. Full tactical. We're not waiting for the cartel. We're ending this tonight. He said to come alone, Diego. He'll kill her if he sees. He'll kill her anyway, Diego said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. This isn't a negotiation. It's an execution. The only question is whose Sarah finally found her voice, a raw, ragged thing. This is my fault, Clara. She has nothing to do with this. This is not your fault, Diego said, his voice softening as he turned back to her, cupping her face in his hands. This is mine. I brought this world to your doorstep, but I swear to you, Sarah, I will bring your friend home, and I will burn Ricardo Vargas's world to the ground. The promise was terrifying and absolute. The man who had shown her such tenderness was gone, replaced by the wolf of the Santini crest, a predator ready to kill to protect his own, the carefully laid plans, the financial warfare. It was all meaningless now. It had come down to blood and bullets, just as it always did in his world. He was about to leave to gather his men, but Sarah grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading, "Take me with you." "Absolutely not," he said, his voice final. "Listen to me." She insisted, her mind racing, piecing together fragments from the ledgers from her father's notes. Vargas won't be at the docks. It's a trap, but not just for you. It's a distraction. He'll have his core team there, but he'll be somewhere else. Somewhere he feels safe. His father's old office, the weeping senator. Diego froze, staring at her. How do you know? Because my father wrote about it. He said Vargas was sentimental, obsessed with the power he stole. He wouldn't run. He would want to watch his victory from his throne, she explained, her voice gaining strength. The ledgers have the blueprints. I know the layout. I know the secret passages my father documented. You'll go in blind without me. I can guide you. Let me help you end this. Diego looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, the fierce intelligence, the absolute refusal to be a damsel in distress. She was not the terrified woman he had found in the snow. She was Michelle Maciello's daughter, a scholar with a spine of steel, and she was right. He was silent for a long moment, the fate of them all resting on his decision. Finally, he gave a single grim nod. "All right," he said, turning to a stunned Marco. "Get her a vest. She rides with me." The night was cold and starless, the air off the water thick with the smell of salt and decay. The old shipping docks were a skeleton of industry, a maze of rusted cranes and decaying warehouses. Pier 4 was at the far end, isolated and shrouded in a pea-deep, oppressive darkness. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Inside a darkened van parked a half-mile away, Sarah's heart hammered against the unfamiliar weight of a Kevlar vest. The war room's theoretical strategy had dissolved into the terrifying tangible reality of a tactical operation. On a monitor in front of her, a thermal drone feed showed a dozen heat signatures inside the warehouse. 12 men, just as we expected. Diego said, his voice a low, calm murmur in her ear. He sat beside her, a rifle resting across his lap, his face a mask of lethal focus. A reception party? Vargas isn't one of them. He's at the VEC building, Sarah said with certainty, her own fear eclipsed by a cold, burning resolve. He's watching this on a screen, waiting for news of your death. Diego's plan was a high-stakes gamble. He had divided his forces. A primary team led by Marco would create a loud, violent diversion at the docks, drawing all of Vargas's attention. While that battle raged, a smaller elite team, led by Diego himself, would infiltrate the VEC building and cut the head off the snake. And Sarah was their guide. "Marco, you have the signal." Diego spoke into his comms. "Engage." On the monitor, the thermal signatures scrambled as Marco's team initiated the assault. The distant pop of suppressed gunfire reached them a second later, a deadly, percussive rhythm in the night. The trap had been sprung. "Let's go," Diego said. Their armored SUV moved silently through the deserted downtown streets, pulling into a dark alley behind the VEC tower. The building was a sleek, modern monolith of glass and steel, the seat of Vargas's legitimate operations and the heart of his power. "Your father's notes said the weeping senator guarded a private elevator," Sarah whispered, her eyes scanning the blueprints she had memorized. "It's in his main office, top floor, but there's another way, a service tunnel connected to the old pneumatic tube system. It comes up in a maintenance on the same floor behind his position." "The forgotten gate," Diego murmured, a grim smile touching his lips. He looked at the 3 men with him, his best. "You heard her. We go in quiet." The next 20 minutes were a blur of silent practice movement. They breached a maintenance door in the alley, descended into the building's sterile guts, and found the old service tunnel just as Sarah's father had documented. The air was stale, the only sound the soft scuff of their boots and their own controlled breathing. Sarah's job was to guide them to point out the junctions and access points her father had so meticulously mapped. She had never felt more terrified or more alive. They emerged into the maintenance closet on the top floor. The silence here was different. Plush carpeting, insulated walls. The silence of power. Diego held up a hand, listening. He peered through the louvered door. Sarah could see past him into Vargas's office. It was opulent, dominated by a massive desk behind which sat a single, ornate Roman bust. The weeping senator. A man stood with his back to them, watching a bank of monitors that showed the firefight at the docks. Ricardo Vargas. He was holding a phone to his ear. "Is he dead yet?" he snarled. "Finish it!" 2 heavily armed guards stood by the main entrance to the office. Clara was nowhere in sight. A cold dread washed over Sarah. Had she been wrong? Diego gave a series of silent hand signals. His team prepared to breach, but as they moved, Sarah's eyes caught something on the blueprints. She still held a detail she'd missed. A small, adjacent room marked Archive. No visible door from the office, an old panic room. She grabbed Diego's arm, her eyes wide, and pointed to the spot on the map, then to the wall behind Vargas's desk. He understood instantly Clara was in there. A frontal assault would get her killed. He changed the signal. This was no longer just an assassination. It was a rescue. What happened next was a symphony of brutal, synchronized violence. Diego kicked open the closet door. Before Vargas could even turn, one of Diego's men had a silenced pistol to the heads of each of his guards, neutralizing them without a sound. Vargas spun around his face, a mask of shock and disbelief. Santini, "You're dead." Reports were exaggerated. Diego set his own weapon leveled at Vargas's chest. "It's over, Ricardo. Your men at the docks are walking into a meat grinder. Your cartel partners received a very interesting data packet about your accounting practices 10 minutes ago. Your empire is gone." Vargas's eyes darted around, looking for an escape. He lunged for a panic button on his desk, but Diego was faster. He didn't shoot. He closed the distance and slammed Vargas back against the wall, the impact echoing in the silent office. The girl, Diego, snarled his face inches from Vargas's. "Where is she?" Vargas laughed, a gurgling, defiant sound. "Too late. Even if you kill me, you lose." At that moment, from behind the wall where Sarah had pointed, came a muffled scream. Diego didn't hesitate. He shoved Vargas toward his men. "Hold him!" Then he turned to the wall, a solid panel of polished mahogany. He found the invisible seam Sarah's father had marked on the blueprints and slammed his shoulder against it. The panel gave way, revealing a heavy steel door. As he worked on the keypad, Sarah rushed to the monitors, showing the feed from the docks. She saw Marco's team methodically neutralizing Vargas's men, but she also saw Clara being dragged from the warehouse by one last desperate thug. A gun to her head. They were heading for the water. "Diego, they have her. They're taking her to the pier." Diego cursed. The lock on the panic room finally clicking open. He yanked the door open to reveal a small, soundproofed room and a timer on a small explosive device counting down from 30 seconds. There was no one inside. It was another trap. The scream had been a recording. It was all a diversion. Diego breathed, horror and fury wearing in his eyes. He wanted to split my attention. He was never going to trade. He spun back to Vargas, who was now smiling, a triumphant, ugly sneer on his face. Checkmate. Diego raised his pistol, but before he could fire, Sarah screamed, "No!" She had seen it in the ledgers, a final desperate piece of leverage. "His son. The ledgers show he has a son. Hidden in a school in Switzerland. Tell him you have the boy, Diego." Diego froze his eyes, locking with Sarah's. He saw the certainty on her face and trusted her. He turned back to Vargas, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "You're right, Ricardo. I lose Clara. I lose. But you lose more. You lose Mateo." The smirk vanished from Vargas's face, replaced by pure, abject terror. "How?" "The ledgers tell all," Diego said, pressing his advantage. "Call off your man at the docks. Let the girl go, or the next call I make is to my associates in Geneva, and your son will pay for your sins." It was a standoff. Two fathers, their legacies, and their children hanging in the balance. The comms in Diego's ear crackled. "Boss, he's got the girl on the edge of the pier. We don't have a clear shot." Vargas stared at Diego, his mind racing. He saw the absolute, unflinching resolve in Santini's eyes. He had lost. With a trembling hand, Vargas pulled out his phone. He barked a single defeated order in Spanish. "Let her go." A moment later, Marco's voice came through the comms, filled with relief. He released her. "She's safe. We have her." A collective breath was released in the room. But as Diego kept his gun trained on Vargas, a flicker of movement caught his eye. One of Vargas's guards, who he thought was unconscious, was raising a small pistol in his hand, aimed not at Diego, but at Sarah. There was no time to think. Diego shoved Sarah to the ground, spinning to shield her with his own body. As the gun fired, pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in his shoulder. He returned fire. A single precise shot, and the guard crumpled to the floor. Vargas saw his chance. In that split second of chaos, he lunged for the gun one of his other men had dropped, but he never made it. 2 shots fired from the doorway struck him square in the chest. Everyone froze. Marco stood in the doorway, his pistol smoking his face grim. He was reaching for a weapon boss. Diego sagged against the desk, clutching his shoulder, his blood staining the fine gray wool of his sweater. It was over, really over. Sarah rushed to his side, her hands fluttering over his wound, her face a mess of tears and terror. "You're hurt," she cried. He looked up at her, a pain-triumphant smile on his lips. "I promised," he rasped, "that I would keep you safe." And then as his men surrounded them, calling for the medic, he finally allowed his eyes to close. The week that followed was a quiet storm of recovery and consolidation. Diego survived. The bullet had missed any major arteries, but the damage to his shoulder was severe. He spent 3 days in the estate's medical wing, a space Sarah refused to leave. She sat by his bedside, reading from her father's journal, her voice a steady, comforting presence in the quiet room. She was done with running, done with being a victim of circumstance. She had chosen her side. Clara, shaken but physically unharmed, had been debriefed and sent to a secure, luxurious spa in Arizona to recover with a quiet promise from Diego to financially secure her for life. The threat to her was over. Vargas's empire built on betrayal crumbled just as quickly. With the news of his death and the leaked ledgers, his cartel partners descended like vultures, tearing his organization apart to reclaim what he had stolen. The war was over. On the 4th day, Diego was moved back to his own suite. He was weak, his arm in a heavy sling, but his eyes were clear. He found Sarah on the balcony overlooking the mountains, the hard drive on the table beside her. "What's to become of all this?" she asked quietly, gesturing to the sprawling estate, the guards patrolling the perimeter, the empire he now commanded without rival. "It changes," he said, coming to stand beside her, his good arm coming to rest on the small of her back. "Your father gave us the means to make it legitimate. That ghost empire he built for you, we'll merge it with my own legitimate assets. We'll cut away the rot. It will take time, but the 5-year plan I told you about it starts today." He looked at her, his expression serious. "This is still your choice, Sarah. The threat is gone. I can still give you that life, the one where you disappear. And be alone," she said, turning to face him. "I've spent my entire life feeling like I was on the outside looking in. First as a quiet, bookish girl, then as the daughter of a man I never really knew. For the first time here with you in the middle of all this chaos. I feel like I belong somewhere." She placed a hand on his chest over his heart. "My father asked me to trust the wolf cub. He asked me to help you restore the honor of your family. Our family." A wave of profound emotion washed over Diego's face. He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I don't deserve you. We can argue about that later," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "For now, just get better. We have a company to build." 6 months later, Sarah stood on that same balcony. The estate was quieter now. The number of armed guards had been reduced, replaced by a more discreet corporate security team. The transition was underway. Diego, his shoulder now healed, save for a puckered scar, was a formidable presence in the world of legitimate business. Using the same ruthless intelligence he had honed in the underworld to build a new kind of empire. She rested a hand on the slight, gentle curve of her stomach. She was 4 months pregnant. After the war was won, in the quiet peace that followed their partnership forged in fire, and secrets had deepened into a love that was as fierce and unwavering as the mountains around them. Diego came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on their unborn child. "He would have been proud of you." Diego said quietly, pressing his chin to her shoulder. "He would have been proud of us," she corrected him, leaning back against his solid strength. She looked out at the vast, wild landscape. Her life was nothing like the quiet academic existence she had once envisioned. It was complicated, dangerous, and built upon a foundation of blood and secrets. But it was also a life filled with a fierce love, an unshakable loyalty, and a profound sense of belonging. She had been saved by the wolf cub, but she in turn had shown him how to build a legacy, not of fear, but of honor. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was their ending. And it was just the beginning.